You're listening to a podcast by Great Kids. To learn more about us, visit our website at greatkidsinc.org.
This is Different Eyes, the view from the heart of another, a Great Kids podcast about overcoming bias in others and in ourselves. We'll be talking about how we can learn to see what others see, and vice versa, helping others see what we see. Our discussions will revolve around bias, cognitive bias and implicit bias, and how this all relates to the work that you do to support families. "2020 has been quite a year. So much has unfolded all around us, impacting each of us in a variety of ways. As we talked about many of these impacts, how they were the same sometimes and other times greatly different, depending on where we were on our journeys, where we've been in our lives, where we are, and where we're going. One day, our conversation evolved into a discussion of cognitive bias and all the ways that this affects decision-making, ours and everyone else's too, without us even realizing it. The conversation got interesting enough that it sparked an idea. That idea gave birth to this podcast. We'll be talking about bias and how that relates to the world of home visiting. It is our hope that by beginning to look through the eyes of others and also helping them to see what we see, we might all start to see things that maybe without each other's help, we never would have seen. When my daughter was a young teenager, she had a birthday party at a swimming pool. I was sitting around playing lifeguard and capitalizing on one of those rare opportunities to listen in on their conversations. One of the girls accidentally bumped another in the head. She apologized, saying, "I thought you were over there." The response from the accidental victim was, "You always think wrong." Over the years, we've laughed about that exchange. But in the context of cognitive bias, the idea that we think wrong is not that far off. Hi, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining in on this conversation with us. I'm grateful to have one of my favorite people here with me as we begin this adventure together. Shauna Donaldson is the Executive Director of Great Kids and has a long history in the field of home visiting. And together, for the next few months, we'll be wading through what we feel is an extremely fascinating and timely topic, bias. Most importantly, cognitive bias.
Well, Dana, thanks first of all for bringing this podcast to life, and then for selecting such an important topic for us to start with. I'm excited about these conversations and what they might mean to us both personally and professionally. So before we get started, let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about cognitive bias. You know, every single day we are called upon in the world to interpret things around us. And the brain is super powerful. But unfortunately, to work as rapidly as it does, it relies on some shortcuts. And those shortcuts can lead to some limitations for us.
Yeah, so cognitive bias basically is a systematic error in thinking that happens due to those shortcuts that our brain takes. So our brains are forced to simplify lots of information in order to process it really quickly. Those biases are a feature of the human brain that allow us to rapidly make sense of the world and to reach decisions almost instantly.
Right. You know, and it's important to note that we all have cognitive biases. It's just easier to see those in other people than it is to see in ourselves.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. So maybe my daughter's friend would have been more accurate if she would have said, "You always think wrong,"
Right.
and so do I. But that's a pretty hard fact to face, even especially, I guess, if you're a 13-year-old, right?
Yeah. We all like to think that we make judgments and decisions that we're being very objective and logical.
Oh, I know.
But
I always am.
right. You're always right. But the truth is that these biases or these errors in thinking can often trip us up without us even realizing it. And, as I was thinking about this, I can't tell you the number of times my 14-year-old has asked me a question and I've given an answer only to recognize later that what I said was automatic. Like I didn't even question that. And I may not have even known where that truth that I had originated.
Right. Yeah. So we do that a lot. And I think not only do we all have biases, what's sort of fun about talking about all this is that we all have the same sorts of biases. And so that's going to be the subject of this podcast.
Right. How can we use our understanding of these biases to help us see things through the eyes of others? To help us understand maybe how they've come to the conclusions that they have about the world around them.
Yeah, yeah. So there are dozens of types of cognitive bias I've learned as I've really been sort of digging into this. And we won't have time to talk about all of them, obviously, but we will, however, talk about maybe a dozen or so of them that I think will feel familiar to everyone.
Yeah. Each week, starting with this episode, we're going to explore a specific cognitive bias and discuss how this might affect our lives as well as the work of home visitors.
Yeah. So at this point in sort of our conversation, it may be hard to believe that the human brain can actually give us faulty information. So much so that two people could view the exact same information and make two very different conclusions. Most of us struggle to kind of understand this or really to believe it, I think, in some ways. So Shauna, if we can, before we start discussing our first cognitive bias, I'd like us to sort of demonstrate with a simple but very classic example, one that I think is likely fairly well known to most parents and probably to a lot of the early childhood people that are listening in on this. So I sent you a picture, and I'd like for you to quickly take a look at that picture. And what is it? Tell us what it is that you see first when you first look at that picture.
Okay. I see a rabbit. And his head's kind of looks like it's sticking out of water, and his ears are there in the back.
Okay. So now I'm familiar with this concept from many years of reading the Duck Rabbit kids book many times. But interestingly enough, I see exactly the opposite at first glance. I see the duck. So I'm really prone to, when I first look at it, see the duck first. And I have to work to see it the way you see it, which is the rabbit first.
Yeah. Now that you've said that, if I go back, what I thought were ears could actually be the duck bills, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So see, there's a beautiful example. Two people looking at the same information really can see two different things. Each of our brains make really quick decisions, and it becomes what we believe.
Right. I mean, of course, if you explain it to me and you kind of tell me how you see this picture, I can start to look at it through your eyes and then maybe see it as you do. But while everyone at some point can be made to see either a duck or a rabbit, there's one thing that no one can see. You cannot, no matter how hard you try, see both the duck and the rabbit at exactly the same time. So even though all the information for both is there, in order to process it, our brains have to pick one or the other and commit to that. So obviously this is a cute and fun example, but we live in a world where in some fashion, almost everything we can see or that we do see is viewed in multiple ways. So as a result, we constantly find ourselves having to choose between duck and rabbit, or in reality, of course, things that are much more important to us.
Right. It's so fascinating to just to think about that. You know, the brain feature, this particular brain feature can lead to blind spots for us.
Yeah.
Times when it can become very hard for us to see something through somebody else's eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is maybe a good time to segue into our discussion of the first of these cognitive biases that we're going to talk about. And the one specifically we'll talk about for the rest of our time together today. Our bias for the week or for this episode is confirmation bias, one that I think most of us will actually find very familiar. So by definition, confirmation bias is the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of what we already believe. So Shauna, that means that my brain makes incredibly quick decisions by showing a preference for ideas that confirm what I already think is true.
Mm.
So if we think about it, let's take an example. So let's say, for example, that I believe that left-handed people are better at math than right-handed people, and it's actually not just an example. It really is something that I know I truly believe. So whenever I come across someone who's both left-handed and good at math, I place great importance on this, right? Because my brain sees this as evidence that backs up what I already believe. And I don't know why I believe that, but it's something that's just in my head. So um, I I think that even though this is the part that's sort of interesting to me. So even though I have both my mother and my daughter, who my mother was left-handed, my daughter is left-handed, and they're both sort of notoriously, by their own admission, terrible at math.
Yeah.
I still tend to believe that left-handed people are good at math. So not only do we tend to look for proof that backs up what we believe, we also tend to ignore or discount
Mhm.
examples that don't support our beliefs.
Mhm. You know, interestingly enough, that also can impact our memory of information. If it supports our belief, we
Yeah.
will remember it better than that which does not.
Yeah, so if I were to see a news story about a left-handed person who flunked their math test, it's very likely I might not even notice it, but if I noticed it, I probably wouldn't remember it, right? Because it's not
Mhm.
something that really backs up what I believe.
Yeah. You know, this year has been full of examples around us and people all around us doing exactly this.
Yeah,
We are all very convinced that we're very right about things these days, very controversial things.
yeah. And people who disagree with us are just as convinced that they're right about exactly the opposite thing. So whether it's maths or politics, we're surrounded by by uh, by this one action. Can you think of any examples that might help bring this closer to the work that we're sort of talking about here in the field of home visiting?
You know, when this topic, when you had identified this as our first topic, I spent some time thinking about it and trying to connect it to both work experience and professional experience. And when I go back to my home visiting days, which aren't that remote, I can recall sometimes finding myself that believing once a family disengaged in home visiting, maybe like if they missed one or
Hmm.
two
Yeah,
visits,
yeah,
right? I automatically believed that I would not be able to re-engage them again no matter what I did. And unfortunately, as a result, right, in hindsight, instead of looking for those creative, intentional ways that I might reconnect with the family, I kind of went on auto drive, right? I found myself doing the old standbys of maybe dropping by for a visit, sending one or two texts or maybe a note. And then I'd go, well, they're not coming back. And I'd just stop altogether. So, what I realize now is that I was using this confirmation bias to say to myself, well, this family is going to be like these
yeah.
other families who stop visiting. They won't reengage no matter what I try.
Right. And as you were talking, I was thinking about how, we talk in the training room about the beliefs for change, and GGK has some very, Great Kids has kind of created some very specific beliefs for change that are important, that we have to kind of believe these things in order um, to remain strengths-based as we work with people. And so I think what you're saying is essentially that this confirmation bias, this great example that you gave, can prevent us from sort of being in that strength-based place, because it's like I was thinking again as you were talking about that, how many times I've heard in the research, and so now I believe that engagement is a big problem, right? So most families are not going to stick around and be a part of the program. So when one family starts to sort of drop off the radar, I'm convinced, and I accept that because of my confirmation bias. I say, yep, see, that just proves what all I've heard or thought before, right? So yeah, exactly.
And unfortunately, right, this type of bias, just from our conversation, we realize that it can prevent us from looking at situations objectively. And it can
Yeah.
influence the decisions we make that might lead us to poor choices. So, like in my example of my home visiting situation, my approach to encourage a family to visit again looked the same no matter what family it was, because I already believed that it didn't matter.
Right.
And Dana, as I thought about this, I thought, you know what? I know how I feel when people make assumptions about me
Right.
based on their experiences with others who might have looked like me, talked like me, or appeared to be like me. I felt
Right.
misunderstood, hurt, ignored, right? All of those things.
Yeah. Yeah, we all want to be seen for the individuals that we are, and I think one of the challenges in home visiting is to maintain that individuality. That every experience is going to be different. You may have done thousands of home visits, right? But this is
Right.
not one of those. This is a new home visit with a new family, a different family, and so it's this bias. That not only leads to stereotypes, but actually reinforces them. So unfortunately, we all have confirmation bias. Not something that we can any of us can claim, oh, sorry, not me, I don't have that. We all have it to a certain degree. And even if you believe you're the most open-minded person in the world, it's very likely that bias will shape your opinions. And it's very difficult to override this natural tendency.
Mhm. So what do we do about this? What are some things we can try?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Um, I think if we know about confirmation bias, so by having conversations like we're having today, and we accept the fact that it exists, and accept the fact that it exists in each of us, we can make an effort to recognize it by being intentionally curious about opposing views and really listening to what others have to say and why, especially when we disagree. So this simple but not easy strategy can help us better see through different eyes.
I so appreciate the intentional listening part of that,
Yeah,
because it's important to remember that the way to work through something with someone who sees things differently than us is not with an aggressive argument. When we attack someone's beliefs or their familiar ideas, they tend to respond defensively.
sure. I mean, when someone attacks my beliefs, I know I'm prone to dig in my heels, right, and become even more attached to the very thing that I probably or maybe need to see differently. So, what can you do when you bump into these kinds of situations?
One of my favorite suggestions is to use imagination and experience.
Mm.
By telling other people's stories, we can take them on a little imaginative vacation
Yeah.
where they might be able to see something through someone else's eyes, right? So if
Right.
we can poke those little holes in each other's confirmation biases, maybe light can shine through that will allow us to see the bigger world beyond our own walls.
Yeah, right. So I like the way you phrased that, an imaginative journey. I think that's powerful, and I think because this is maybe such an important strategy for helping folks poke holes in those walls of confirmation bias, maybe you could do that for us. So let's pretend for a minute that that you're a supervisor and you have a home visitor who comes to you, young home visitor who has, she's heard all the stories from everybody else that it's really hard to keep parents engaged and it's hard to get them to actively participate in visits, and that they don't stick around long. And that's been sort of her experience so far. So she's sort of got this confirmation bias that most parents really don't get too terribly involved in the program. And so she has one particular family that she's working with right now that's that they don't when she goes for the visit, sometimes they cancel a lot of visits. She goes for the visits and they don't really seem interested particularly in the topics that they're talking about. They don't really want to play games with their child, so the activities kind of fall flat a lot of the times. And so she's come to you as her supervisor, and she's seeking your help, but basically saying, look, I'm kind of ready to give up on these folks.
Mm-hmm.
How might you take her on a little imaginative journey that would help start to poke holes in maybe that confirmation bias that she has there?
Yeah. And Dana, I'm glad we're doing this, because I think this is one of the things that when I was a home visitor and working in a program, I became really passionate about what we called outreach or creative outreach. And, we tried to do it ahead of time, meaning we really worked on building strong relationships with people up front.
Sure. Yeah.
So that way we could stay connected. And if we saw things happening, like them missing visits or seeming detached, we already had some of that relationship built up because we've worked on it ahead of time. And but I can think of one particular situation that we had with a program family, a dear family that had been engaged and had seemed to really enjoy the visits and had been consistent, for the most part. And then the family just like all of a sudden missed 2 or 3 visits. And as the home visitor and I, as we discussed it, we were just kind of like scratching our heads like, what's the disconnect here? And instead of us going into this, well, I'll send a text and a note and I'll exit, we decided let's dig in here, right? Let's really be very thoughtful about how we try to connect with this family. And so this dear home visitor sent personal notes, sent some cards, had dropped by one day and had dropped off just a note and just a little, I don't know, it was like a little magnet or something, but it dropped off something from the family, but was very consistent in trying to reach out and not saying, where are you, but more about, I miss you.
Right.
I miss seeing your baby, that kind of thing. And
relationship stuff.
Right, exactly. And maybe 3 or 4 weeks after doing that, the home visitor got a call, middle of the week, afternoon, unexpected, from the family. And I believe it was the mother that had called. And she had shared that her brother, her younger brother, had been diagnosed with cancer a couple of weeks prior. And as a result of that diagnosis, the family had been really just all in, of course, with this younger brother. Because he was a minor child, they were taking turns staying at the hospital because they were a small family, only 2 or 3 people, right? And so the parents were taking turns staying with the brother. And then when they weren't staying in the hospital, they were trying to take care of their baby and go to work and get groceries and sleep. And the parents shared that, she just really, as much as she had enjoyed home visiting and wanted to stay in home visiting, she had nothing left to give at the end of the day, whether that was responding to a letter, a call, a text.
Right.
But that the family had really appreciated all of those notes. Even though the home visitor didn't know what was going on, the home visitor had shared some compassion, right? And through that experience, this home visitor now is able to see through this parent's eyes, right? This wasn't a parent that just dropped away. This was a parent that was having this really tough journey, right? And was doing the best they could. And so it was a big moment for all of us about, just not making those assumptions and really trying to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and think about what those experiences are like.
Right. So painting a picture like that, taking this home visitor who had come to you, in my hypothetical situation, who had come to you and ready to give up, but being able to take her on a journey like that, that was, you know, help them get inside people's heads, help to remind them that we don't know everyone's story, even though we know tendencies, we know stereotypes, we know things that we might rush to snap judgments on. I think that's a great example of how you could use a story to help poke holes in those confirmation biases and help this particular home visitor move forward in her work with families and maybe in her work with families in general, right? Not just this family,
Right.
but start to see past her own bias in that instance, right?
Even in the particular story that the example you give of the home visitor who's, is noticing this disengagement in visits, who knows what that parent could be experiencing?
Right.
Right? Anything from depression to family stress, concerns about housing, concerns about their child, right? And not everybody is always eager or ready or able to tell their story in a way that we understand what they're going through.
Right.
So it's so important that we all just take those deep breaths and kind of go,
Yeah.
what's here that I don't see, instead of going, well, this is what this means because I've seen it before.
Yeah. Great example. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So we've always got to keep in mind that the people who most need to hear our message are the least likely to accept it readily. And we have to work together to overcome each of our biases so that we can see the world in the new ways that are going to be so important as we try to figure out what our world looks like now, right?
Right. It takes time, compassion, and a willingness to work together through our differences.
Yeah. I mean, I think patience, patience and compassion, kindness, all of those things are really going to be critical for us. And I think that's well said, Shauna. So, okay, I could talk about this for hours, but I think we're probably right about at the end of our time together. And I wanted to take a minute to thank everybody for joining us. We'll be back again in 2 weeks to wrestle with another of the common cognitive biases and explore how it impacts our lives and work and what we might do about it. So in parting, I would just say maybe a cautionary word is to don't believe everything you think, right?
Absolutely.
All right, great. Thanks, everyone.